eligible to be issued at the discretion of the director, subject to meeting a number of criteria. A type 2 permit has limited public notice. It gets mailed notice and publication in the newspaper, but no on-site posting. Like a type 1 permit, it is subject to administrative review. The only difference with the LDC decisions, they, so far as I know, are the only LDC, the only appointed body that makes a decision on a type 2 permit. So it's kind of a modified type 2 process because it's already going before a hearing board. Really, the type is telling us kind of our back-end administrative stuff in terms of what are our types of notice and what are the timelines for getting a decision out. So things like administrative variances, a determination on a non-conforming use, things like our site development permits are already adopted. Excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong table now. I was looking back at type 1. Temporary use. So temporary use permits, which is, again, one of the ones that we are amending now. So it's stuff that is really typically not of super great public interest for most of these. They're fairly ministerial, I would say. The LDC is unique in that it's kind of a modified type 2 process because there is a appointed board as the decision-making body versus the administrator, which is a decision maker for, I believe, all others on those.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions on this slide?
Since you mentioned it, went to the travel limits, could you point us to the figure that was added for the parking lot standard?
Yes.
A page number for reference.
So that is in Division 5. It is figure 15, page 241, figure 15.520.040D.
Okay, I see it.
Yeah.
040D. Okay, thank you.
The wording for the regulation isn't entirely obtuse, but it could be interpreted a different way by an applicant versus an administrator of the code, depending on how you read it. So having the graphic there to show, no, this is what they mean by the standard is super helpful to us.
Good. Okay.
And we had it sitting in a Word document somewhere. I don't know how it got dropped. So
it was always there.
Yep. Any other questions on this slide? Yeah. There were some substantive amendments in a number of areas. So kind of the first piece would be under the definitions section. So this is chapter 15.130. I believe that would be section 040 then under D. So design review is currently set up. There's two changes that we made. It's currently set up as a type 2 permit. So again, limited public notice, 100 days subject to administrator approval, no public hearing, unless there's something affiliated with a landmarks district property. And then it gets bumped up to Landmarks Design Commission. Currently in the definitions, there's a distinction made for this at a threshold of 15,000 square feet for a non-residential project. We looked back to the use table and saw that there is a distinction made not at 15,000, but at 20,000 square feet between the permitted uses for retail and offices. So if you're in one zoning district or another, you may be able to do 20,000 and larger or not. You might be capped at that or just not be permitted to do it. So the intent here was to align the distinction at the use permissions that we have in the use table. Again, just kind of for ease of administration, you could tell an applicant, yes, this use is permitted there, and it's automatically, because of that square footage threshold, subject to type 2 review, or you're allowed to do a lower scale of office or retail use. It's a type 1 review or a minor design project review. And that gets immediately into the other change that we made. There's currently no distinction between the process of review or approval between a major project and minor project at that square footage threshold. So they're both a type 2 permit, max 100 days, limited public notice. administrator approval. Type 1 permits are max 65 days, 0 public notice, and subject to administrator approval. These are smaller scale projects that generally don't encounter the same level of interest and controversy. There's also a residential threshold for minor and major projects. I believe it's max 9 for minor, which also aligns with some other elements, including our current SEPA exemption. And so those changes were meant to, again, kind of align with other existing provisions of the code, but it's really kind of two things accomplished in one there. Any questions on that piece? Okay. A new section that we added would, in very limited cases, require a subsequent pre-application meeting for a project if 5 or more years had passed and some other conditions applied. The other conditions mainly being there's no party related to the previous proponent that was subject to that pre-application meeting. This is to help, I think, suss out some of the I wouldn't say actual confusion happening, but people will have a pre-application meeting. The report that comes from that doesn't technically expire, but it only treats a project from a specific point in time. So building code cycles change, we amend our zoning code, the city changes its public works standards, and someone can have an application, a pre-application report from 6 years ago and try to use the standards of that to then submit permits for a project. And there can be some confusion in the back and forth on what they're submitting to us on those things. So it's a pretty narrow case that we would need to use this, but we felt that it would provide some protection for us and clarity for applicants. There was a section where we removed the authority of an appeal body to affirm a decision on a permit while imposing new conditions. We amended subdivision phasing plan submittal deadlines and standards, as I discussed previously. I believe they now need to be reviewed as a plat alteration, and there is a 2-year deadline after preliminary approval, so it doesn't just hold out until prior to submittal final plat. Murals, the entire chapter was moved to Division 2. It's currently the only chapter left standing in our Division 7 after the sign code was moved to the authority of the building official, which he's very happy about. We also made one amendment in that move to permit murals on facades that are directly along streets, which is currently prohibited. So there was one line item that was struck in that move to permit that to happen. We also recodified some short plat extension language that somehow got lost in codification of several recent zoning ordinances. I believe it's literally just a clerical error on behalf of the Muni Code adopter for that. And binding site plan, the other change that we made in addition to the repeal or replace is those approvals would be type 2 permits. So again, that's administrative approved by city staff, max 100 days, somewhat limited public notice and comment period for that. And that would be for both the preliminary approval as well as the final approval of that.
Questions, anyone? I do. So if you go through a pre-application meeting and the code changes before, and it's 5 years, you're still bound by the pre-application meeting? Or
You are
you're
not.
bound by the code, right?
Correct. And the potential confusion is that some folks walk in the door having not participated in the previous pre-application meeting, having bought a property that's received a previous entitlement
I see.
pursuant to a pre-application report and treat the stuff that's in that report as if it applies to the project that they're now trying to proceed with. We've actually had a handful of cases just this past year where there's been some level of confusion as to the applicability of the information contained in these reports. So in actual effect, there is no real change on the ground for how we administer things. You walk in through the door today, you're bound by the codes that we have adopted today for building, for zoning. This just, again, would provide an avenue for us to require an updated meeting to get a fresh take at all the revised codes that we've adopted since then. Because at the very least, within 5 years, we're under a new building code cycle, and there are all sorts of subtle changes that can impact pieces of project feasibility or major changes like the adoption of the Washington Energy Code, which has done a real number on some developers in terms of them trying to pencil out a project.
So that, so just the 5 years is the 5 years is just noticing people that they don't have an eternity before they have to come back in and.
Planning staff have started to put that note into pre-application reports regardless that, this is the code as it exists now. And when you walk through the door, it might be different. The 5 year is really just, there's a point where the information becomes useless in a way because of how many changes have been made. And so we just wanted there to be some metric, and 5 years seemed about right for that.
And I would encourage you to remember, pre-applications, people can walk in the door with a napkin drawing basically,
Mhm.
and really look at, how the code, and this is really a service to the developer to have everyone around the table to help them understand the impacts of their project and the requirements for their project. So again, it's more of a service, and it just puts a deadline on that so staff have the ability to say, this does not last forever. And-
Yeah, it's just the 5 years is throwing me because it's less than 5 years if the code changes, right?
For building code, certainly. And the other key piece of this is that Part B, which also has to be met to require subsequent pre-application, is there has to be no consistent party between the person who got the previous report and someone who's trying to walk in the door and pursue a new project. It's that we want to get someone who wasn't around the first time and is trying to use a property entitlement that they may have bought essentially when they purchased a property as if it kind of lasts in perpetuity. So it's really just a way for us to try to get updated information to applicants as part of these projects.
I had a question related, I think I know, but at what point in the process is there any vesting right assigned to the process or the project? Is it the plat approval or is it? I mean, coming
There's-
in pre-app, obviously, it's just very preliminary.
Yeah, there's different types of projects. Dan might be able to speak a little more coherently on this, but it would depend on what they had pursued. So
Right.
there's probably different statute,
Oh.
I imagine, around the
Yeah,
vesting of
it's
subdivisions
not
versus a
important, yeah.
building permit. Yeah.
I just was curious because I think there's an expectation by developers sometimes that if you get in and lock
Right.
things down, that you can work with an old code. or-
It- Their applications vest to the code that's in place at the time that they're submitted. So a building permit application, an application for a preliminary plat, that's what locks in that.
That's not the pre-application.
But yeah, it's not at the pre-app, and there's nothing in our code that offers up any kind of vesting at the pre-app point either. Some codes do, but ours doesn't. It's just, they would vest at the time that they would make those subsequent applications to the pre-app.
So the application is another step downstream, but it's not yet approval. It's just the marker that they've established. They've got their
Yeah,
paperwork. in
Right.
and-
Yeah, under the state law, they have to vest at the time those things are submitted.
Okay.
Thank you. Any more on the items on this slide?
Oh, I'm
Okay,
sorry. I'm
no
sorry.
worries.
No, I-
Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Co-living housing, this was the sole change that we made to the permitted use tables for residential uses. Again, adopting co-living housing and having it mirror the same permissions for multifamily as we're effectively required to do by statute on that. There were a number of amendments made to the non-residential use table. And again, staff purpose and intent with these was again to try to align the table with other existing provisions of the code. So some of this is based on as well some proposals that have walked in through the door recently that we felt that we do not really have sufficiently clear regulations as to how to process these or think about the use. And one of these is with private parking lots. So someone wants to establish a parking lot just for private vehicles somewhere in the city for either long-term, short-term lease or something like that. And as well as thinking about the fact that we are at kind of this interstate intersection here, I'm thinking about the potential for freight truck parking lots. So as soon as we got to thinking about parking, we wanted to make sure we covered all the different types of surface vehicle parking and distinguish between them based on certain levels of appropriateness. So to that end, in table 15.310.040 non-residential uses, you'll see some of the other amendments is we've put a number numeric designation for these tables because they previously were all just considered part of the same subchapter and didn't have a unique identifier. Again, purely administrative clerical stuff. Another change made to that table was to prohibit the heavy services use from the CC district. That's the Central Commercial District downtown. Heavy services is long-term storage of like heavy mechanical machinery, outdoor storage of large materials that didn't feel kind of aligned with the purposes and intents of that zone as is laid out in the same division 3 around zoning. Radio stations are currently a permitted use in the RL zones. A change would prohibit that use in that zone. Offices up to 20,000 square feet are currently permitted effectively as of right in the RS and RL zones. So this would prohibit those uses by striking them from there. Mini storage units, which are deemed mini warehouse units as defined in our code, would be prohibited in the RM and IH districts. The RM is the medium density residential, IH is heavy industrial. There are currently conditional uses there. By striking them from those, that use would only be permitted in the IL light industrial zone and only as a conditional use. So there would be one zone where that would be permitted through the conditional use permit process. On-site hazardous waste treatment would be prohibited in the CC zone, similar to heavy services. Didn't seem to meet the purpose and intent of a vibrant downtown community to be processing hazardous waste next to a cafe. Tow vehicle storage area is currently a permitted use in the IL zone. That would shift to a conditional use. It is currently permitted still in the heavy industrial IH zone. And there were also several revisions to notes on that table. Note 5 would be revised for kind of clarity of application. And then note 11 is what I would summarize as a corner store note. So there are a number of uses that you'll find note 5 already applied to in the commercial use table, where certain commercial uses are permitted now in our residential zones. With some of them have that note 5 that requires that separation of a minimum 1,200 feet from a certain zone or a certain type of use. Note 11 would also require that in some zones, some of those commercial uses be effectively on a corner lot at the intersection of two public street frontages. So there's a lot there. I'm happy to take any questions or discussion you guys might have on those pieces.
Questions? No questions.
Okay. There were some amendments made to the next table in that chapter, the special use table. So that's one of them was to provide a new use as well as a new definition back in 15.130 for university. Believe it or not, the definition for school specifically only refers to minors and appears to refer to K-12. So we provided a definition and zoning zoned use permissions in the table for university with some pretty wide latitude as to what constitutes a university to account for the fact that there are a number of non-teaching based functions of a university, research, residential uses. And so that can be found in the definition table or the definition chapter, excuse me, as well as establishing new use definition for public parking lots. Golf courses would change to be prohibited in the suburban residential zone and to be permitted only in the public reserve zone, PR. Golf driving ranges similarly prohibited RS and newly permitted in the regional center mixed use zone. Recreational vehicle parks would change from a permitted to conditional use in the CH zoning district, the commercial highway zone, and become newly accessory in the public reserve zone. That is to sort of retroactively account for the fact that we have a PR zoned recreational vehicle park out at the fairgrounds already in operation, as well as adding note 13, which effectively mirrors amended note 5 from the previous table, and only for small commercial indoor recreation. So things like a yoga studio, to have that same separation requirement established.
So
No.
I had a question about golf courses.
Yeah.
If it is only permitted in PR, that means we can only have public golf courses, and there essentially it prohibits private golf courses.
It would prohibit private golf courses from, that's correct. A couple of things to bear in mind is the only private golf courses currently would be permitted in the suburban residential zone as of now. So there are no commercial zones or other zoning designations that would permit them at this time. The rationale behind that was to try to align that use in the use table with the description of that zone that is found in 15-300-040, which is not part of your packet because it was not subject to amendment, but that describes the city's zoning districts, and subsection A describes the residential suburban zone to allow single-family detached dwellings, duplexes, townhomes, compatible housing types, reinforce Ellensburg's established pattern of attractive and walkable residential neighborhoods, provide standards and guidelines promoting integration of usable open space for residential uses. So it didn't seem to, there are others as well, and it didn't seem to align with kind of the general description and purpose and intent of that zoning district to have it permitted in that table, or in that zone, excuse me.
I guess I'm concerned that what we're saying is that if you want to develop a private golf course in Ellensburg, you can't.
That is effectively what that would do.
And is that appropriate to do that?
I can only speak to the rationale behind our draft. The Planning Commission did not discuss that when they forwarded these recommendations. I think maybe to get out a little bit ahead of my skis, another thing to consider with the zoning designations that we have as part of our land capacity analysis that we're doing with our current periodic update. I don't know that a lot of the analysis is accounting for residential zoned land as being potentially, I won't say encumbered, but used for a non-residential purpose like a golf course. And if they were to kind of include that as a actual permitted use, say that they imagine 1 9-hole golf course, that might do a lot in terms of how much land we would need in our UGA. So trying to think, that's probably a little outside the scope of the amendments that we're thinking about now, but these pieces really reinforce each other between the GMA and how we regulate uses on the ground, especially when they're doing things like housing and land capacity analysis.
It just seems like we ought to have somewhere. And if that means to create a new recreation open space zone or something, I don't know. But it just doesn't seem, not that anyone's knocking down the doors trying to build golf courses inside the city limits, which
I can imagine the rates on the meter would be pretty steep.
yeah, and the land would be more expensive than if you purchased outside, and so maybe it's not a big deal, but it just seems like we're being exclusionary somehow.
It would exclude it to that zone, which is typically owned by public entities and used for public purposes. And I think that's even in the description of the PR zone.
Right.
So yeah.
We don't, obviously we don't have this situation, but I do think it's not uncommon for municipalities that own golf courses to realize that, kind of like swimming pools, they are very expensive to operate and maintain, and it isn't uncommon to sell those off to the private sector. So we don't have that problem because we don't have a municipal course, but it's sort of, I don't think it's inevitable that all public golf courses are government owned or publicly owned. So I would.
What
share
if
that.
if someone were interested, the city could lease
I guess you could public reserve it.
to a private entity, maybe? I don't know. I
think the closest thing I can think of in terms of unintended consequences would be the old hospital building, which was ultimately torn down. But one of the barriers to redeveloping it was zone PR because it was at one time owned by the university. And the developer couldn't do anything until it was rezoned, which required a comp plan change first and then rezoning. So, but fortunately, we don't have that problem with municipal and golf courses, but I do think it is a little narrow.
I'm also reminded that we bought the Rotary Park area. It was originally purchased
Hmm.
to be a golf course,
That's true. I remember that. Yeah. Yeah.
and then they decided not to. So,
And now we're getting a railroad.
and
And, you know, yeah. I mean,
so I just registering a concern. I don't know if there's a solution.
Council has the, obviously, discretion to amend the proposal that's in front of you. That would take some precise wording and probably want to have a sidebar with clerk and management before going about that. But there is obviously that latitude.
I think one option when you get to hearing would be to just leave it as is. And that could be something that we study as a part of a future update.
Yeah, or amending the definition of the RS zone to include open space, or, you know,
Right.
uses compatible with open space, or agricultural uses even.
I was also thinking about the RS zone because historically, when property has been annexed into the city, the default zone is RS. And we could see, conceivably, we could see an annexation of a large acreage privately owned parcel that, who knows, could be any number of things that we don't currently have. So I guess that's the way I would lean. I would lean toward leaving it in as a permitted, or maybe it's a conditional under the RS, but yeah.
And remember that this will be presented in an ordinance. You have the opportunity to make changes to an ordinance. And I would definitely recommend, if you're thinking something substantive, that we make sure to that there are no unintended consequences to the changes. It's difficult to do that at the dais sometimes.
Yeah.
Any other questions on this slide? There were several other miscellaneous amendments that were made. And again, these were all drafted and then forwarded to Planning Commission for discussion, which I'll touch on in a second. But one of them would revise a side yard calculation in several of our residential zones. And that's to allow a little more flexibility into the precise footprint that folks could go on while still maintaining equivalent levels of space between site-specific residential developments, as well as reducing the standard in the medium density residential to a flat 5 feet for the side yard setback. It would also clarify standards for a lot of the permitted structural projections that are currently allowed to go into yard setbacks. Currently, eaves are allowed to extend 3 feet out in the front and rear yards and 2 feet out in the side yards. This would split the difference, make it 2.5 feet all the way around. Again, just so that we have kind of a single standard to review, kind of makes it, I think, easier on behalf of staff for review and a designer to put something together in order to meet that standard. It removes an annual home occupation notification requirement. So we have a home occupation permitting process when folks establish certain income generating uses in residential zones, and that includes an annual notification requirement. After discussion, staff felt that there isn't a ton of necessity behind that annual notification process. It's really just kind of a paperwork thing that we do every year, and have recommended removing that. We would also allow required multifamily open space to be occupied by some of the shared amenity facilities that would be allowed for co-living housing uses on those properties. And then there's a number of changes in the parking code that are really just intended to clarify the existing provisions, some of the new requirements for co-living housing, as well as some amendments around tandem parking for dwelling units. Are there any questions on the items on this slide?
I know it's not a change, but the reduction to 5 feet for the RM, I was trying to recall what the side yard separation requirement is for RL.
For all of those, for the residential districts, for RS, RL, RM, and RH, the table currently reads in that line item 5/10 feet. And the way that that has been interpreted and administered is that one of these side yards is required to be a minimum of 5 feet. One of the side yards is required to be a minimum of 10 feet unless the property is less than 6,000 square feet in size, in which case it's a minimum 5 for both of the side yards. The reduction in the RM zone, the rationale behind that was to provide a little more flexibility for those sort of moderate intensity, medium density residential uses. So small multiplex apartments to give them a little more site flexibility. You may note that we didn't change that in the RH zone. The RH zone change was to require minimum 10 feet for developments in that zone, again, unless they're that 6,000 square feet or smaller, in which case they could still be reduced to 5.
Yeah, thank you for that. That makes sense. I know that the overarching theme was the kind of standard, the individual zones within the residential. In terms of allowing more dense housing, I think the goal was to streamline that process. So there's less difference between the zones than there used to be.
Yeah.
The RM versus RL and so on. So thank you.
Any other questions on this slide? So just to double back on how we got here in the process, the Planning Commission met back on October 9th. Their consent agenda for that meeting is actually on, excuse me, the minutes from that meeting are on the consent agenda. That is under item 5B. You'll find that in packet pages 36 to 38. They did provide a number of technical amendments based on some pretty productive discussion from what staff had drafted. And so those amendments that were discussed and incorporated into our initial draft are all incorporated into those minutes. If you want to kind of see how their sausage got made in pushing this recommendation to you. It also incorporated some feedback in those amendments from DR Horton that we'd received after we'd pushed out the draft and before we could incorporate the letter into the packet, but it got to the commissioners on the table and it's been included in your packet tonight, that correspondence from them. And it changed a single term within the temporary use that had been drafted. And then they moved to forward those recommended code changes to council as they had amended at that meeting. So you'll find a table that kind of summarizes section by section what all these amendments are in Exhibit E. When you guys have this at hearing, the full amendments are again Exhibit A of item 8. And the draft ordinance again is 4975. Are there any lingering questions on that or are we close to time? Okay.
We are close to time,
Okay.
but we have 2 minutes for any more questions. Thank you.
Yes.
I would just like to thank staff. We've needed some code cleanup for a very long time and I really appreciate the work that they've done to get the amendments together and really clarify some important parts of our code. So
Thank you. So we will, I guess, adjourn the study session and be back at 7 p.m.